There were sophisticated writing systems that flourished across ancient Africa for thousands of years, challenging the myth that the continent was illiterate before European contact and revealing intellectual traditions that predate many world civilizations. Welcome back to African Folklore Archives, where we preserve the stories that connect us to our roots. Today, I need to share something with you that's going to challenge one of the most persistent myths about African history. What if I told you that while much of Europe couldn't read or write, African scribes were recording history, conducting business, and preserving knowledge in writing systems so sophisticated that some still puzzle scholars today? And what if I told you that these weren't isolated examples, but part of a rich tradition of African literacy that spans thousands of years? Now, I know what you're thinking. But didn't writing come to Africa through Arab and European contact? That's the story most of us learned, isn't it? The conventional belief is that Africa was primarily an oral culture until outside influences brought writing systems to the continent. But today, I'm going to take you on a journey through ancient African libraries, royal archives, and sacred texts that prove something completely different. We're going to explore writing systems that were invented by Africans, for Africans, centuries and sometimes millennia before any outside contact. I'll show you archaeological evidence that demonstrates African literacy traditions that predate many famous world civilizations. Here's my plan for this journey. We'll start with a discovery that shocked archaeologists, explore 3 major African writing systems that most people have never heard of, and uncover why these incredible achievements have been hidden from mainstream education. By the end of this video, you'll understand that the myth of African illiteracy isn't just wrong. It's a deliberate distortion of historical truth. And the proof is carved in stone, written on ancient manuscripts, and preserved in traditions that are still alive today. Before we dive in, let me ask you something. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from and how the weather is there today. I love knowing where our African folklore family is gathering from around the world. Let me start with a story that happened in 1909, deep in the forests of southeastern Nigeria. British colonial administrator Percy Amari Talbot was documenting what the colonial government called native customs, when he encountered something that completely contradicted his assumptions about African society. Local elders showed him symbols carved into trees, rocks, and sacred objects throughout the forest. These weren't random decorations or simple pictographs. They were part of a complex writing system called Nsibidi that had been used for communication, record-keeping, and spiritual purposes for over 1,000 years. But here's what made Talbot's discovery so remarkable. Nsibidi is an ancient ideographic writing system that originated among the Ajam people of southeastern Nigeria and Cameroon, dating back to at least 2000 BCE. Think about that timeline for a moment. While ancient Mesopotamia was just developing cuneiform writing, African communities were creating their own sophisticated symbol systems. What Talbot had stumbled upon wasn't just a local curiosity. It was evidence of one of the world's oldest indigenous writing systems, created and refined by African minds without any outside influence. Nsibidi is a system of symbols indigenous to southeastern Nigeria that is apparently an ideographic script, though there have been suggestions that it includes logographic elements. But calling it just a script doesn't capture what Nsibidi really represents. This was a complete communication system that could convey complex ideas, emotions, and information through symbols that functioned on multiple levels. The symbols could be carved into wood, drawn on cloth, painted on pottery, or even performed through hand gestures. Nsibidi wasn't just writing. It was a multimedia communication technology that allowed information to be preserved and transmitted across generations in multiple formats. But here's where it gets really interesting. Nsibidi wasn't just used for everyday communication. It was the secret script of powerful societies like the Leopard Society and the Ekp Society, organizations that governed trade, settled disputes, and maintained social order across the region. The symbols were so powerful that only initiated members could learn the full system, creating a form of encrypted communication that protected sensitive information. This brings us to our first major mystery. If Nsibidi was so widespread and sophisticated, why don't we learn about it in schools? Why isn't it mentioned alongside other ancient writing systems when we study the development of human communication? Now, before we go further, I want you to pause and think about something. What topic related to African history baffles you the most? Drop it in the comments below, and I'll research it and make a video about it. Your curiosity drives the stories we explore together. Let's travel north from Nigeria to the ancient kingdom of Kush in what's now Sudan, where we encounter another African writing system that challenges conventional narratives about literacy in Africa. The Meroitic script was developed sometime around 800 BC in Napata, a city-state of Nubia in what today is northern Sudan. But here's what makes the Meroitic script so remarkable. It wasn't adapted from Egyptian hieroglyphs or borrowed from another civilization. The Kushites developed their own unique writing system with its own grammar, vocabulary, and structure. The Meroitic script had two forms: hieroglyphic for formal inscriptions on monuments and temples, and cursive for everyday use on pottery, letters, and business documents. The script remained in use after the capital moved to Meroe until the 7th century AD, meaning it served as the primary writing system for nearly 1,500 years. What's truly remarkable about Meroitic is that it represents a conscious decision by African rulers to assert their cultural independence. The Kushites could have continued using Egyptian hieroglyphs. They had been part of the Egyptian cultural sphere for centuries. Instead, they chose to develop their own writing system, their own literary tradition, and their own way of recording their history and beliefs. The archaeological evidence shows us royal decrees written in Meroitic, religious texts that preserve ancient Kushite beliefs, and even love letters between ordinary people. This wasn't just an elite script used by rulers and priests. Meroitic was a living writing system used by people at all levels of society. But here's the mystery that still puzzles scholars today. While we can read many Meroitic texts, the language itself remains partially undeciphered. We understand the structure, and we know many words, but the complete meaning of many Meroitic inscriptions remains locked away, waiting for future scholars to unlock their secrets. Now let's journey to the highlands of Ethiopia, where we encounter perhaps the most successful of Africa's ancient writing systems, one that's still in use today. The earliest known inscriptions in the Guizi script date to the 5th century BC, making it over 2,500 years old. But unlike Nsibidi and Meroitic, Guizi didn't disappear into history. It evolved, adapted, and survived to become the foundation for multiple modern African writing systems. The Guizi script is a script used in modern-day Eritrea and Ethiopia that dates back to the 1st century CE, and what makes it extraordinary is its sophistication. Guizi began as a consonantal script, but evolved to include vowel markings, creating one of the world's most complete syllabic writing systems. The Kingdom of Aksum used Guizi for everything from royal inscriptions and religious texts to trade agreements and diplomatic correspondence. When you see those towering stone obelisks in Aksum, you're looking at monuments covered in Guizi inscriptions that record the achievements of African kings who ruled an empire that stretched from the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. But here's what should make every African descendant proud. Guizi wasn't just a tool for record-keeping. It became the foundation for an entire literary tradition. Ethiopian scholars used Guizi to translate Greek philosophical works, preserve ancient African oral traditions, and create original works of theology, history, and literature. The famous Ethiopian Orthodox Bible, one of the oldest complete Bibles in the world, was written in Guizi. The Kebra Nagast, which tells the story of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon, was composed in Guizi. Centuries of African intellectual achievement were recorded and preserved in this remarkable writing system. And here's the part that connects directly to today. Guizi is the ancestor of modern Amharic, Tigrinya, and other Ethiopian scripts that are used by millions of people today. When you see Ethiopian text, You're looking at the direct descendant of a writing system that has been serving African communities for over 2,000 years. This is a moment to pause and like this video, comment, and subscribe. Your subscription is support from you, and it means the world to me, as my channel is still young and trying to grow. Together, we're preserving stories that deserve to be told. Now, here's where our story takes a turn that explains why most people don't know about these incredible African achievements. The deliberate erasure of African literacy from historical narratives wasn't accidental. It was systematic. Colonial educators and administrators had a vested interest in portraying Africa as a continent without writing, without literature, and without intellectual traditions. This narrative justified colonial rule by suggesting that Europeans were bringing literacy to supposedly backward peoples. But the evidence tells a completely different story. Archaeological excavations continue to reveal African manuscripts, inscriptions, and written records that prove extensive literacy throughout the continent. From the ancient libraries of Timbuktu to the royal archives of Ethiopian monasteries, Africa has always been home to rich literary traditions. Consider this. While Europe was experiencing what historians call the Dark Ages, African scribes in Timbuktu were copying, preserving, and creating manuscripts on subjects ranging from astronomy and mathematics to poetry and theology. The University of Sankore in Timbuktu had a library containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, making it one of the largest libraries in the world at that time. But these achievements don't fit the narrative that many people learned about Africa. So they were ignored, minimized, or attributed to outside influences. Here's what archaeologists have discovered that should change how we think about African intellectual history. In caves throughout the Sahara, researchers have found rock art with symbols and markings that suggest proto-writing systems dating back thousands of years. In archaeological sites across West Africa, they've uncovered pottery with sophisticated symbol systems that predate many world writing systems. The evidence keeps mounting that Africa wasn't just participating in the development of human literacy. Africa was pioneering it. But there's another dimension to this story that's equally important. These African writing systems weren't just functional, they were beautiful. The artistic elements of Guizi calligraphy, the elegant curves of Meroitic cursive, and the symbolic power of Nsibidi ideographs. These represent aesthetic achievements that rival any artistic tradition in the world. African scribes didn't just record information, they elevated writing to an art form. Manuscripts from Ethiopia feature illuminated texts with intricate designs and brilliant colors. Nsibidi symbols were often incorporated into textiles, creating clothing that literally told stories. Meroitic inscriptions on temple walls combined writing with architectural art to create monuments that were both functional and beautiful. This artistic dimension of African writing challenges another stereotype, that African cultures prioritized oral tradition over written expression. The evidence shows that African communities valued both, creating writing systems that could preserve information while maintaining the aesthetic and spiritual power of oral performance. What we're really looking at here is evidence of African intellectual sophistication that has been systematically excluded from global narratives about human development. These writing systems represent thousands of years of African innovation, creativity, and scholarly achievement. But perhaps the most important thing about these lost scripts isn't just their historical significance. It's what they tell us about the nature of African knowledge systems. These weren't just tools for recording information. They were systems for preserving wisdom, maintaining cultural identity, and transmitting values across generations. When Nsibidi symbols were carved into sacred objects, they weren't just decorative. They were repositories of spiritual knowledge that connected communities to their ancestors and their beliefs. When Meroitic scribes recorded royal decrees, they were participating in a tradition of governance and law that had been refined over centuries. When Ethiopian monks copied Guizi manuscripts, they were preserving not just religious texts but entire worldviews and philosophical systems. I want you to comment on this. Which of these ancient African writing systems surprised you the most? The secret symbols of Nsibidi, the royal scripts of Meroe, or the enduring tradition of Guizi? What questions do these discoveries raise for you about what else we might not know about African intellectual history? The rediscovery of these lost scripts is ongoing. Every year, archaeologists and linguists uncover new evidence of African writing systems. Recently, researchers have identified sophisticated symbol systems among the Bamum people of Cameroon, the Vai people of Liberia, and other African communities. Some of these systems are ancient, others were developed more recently, but all of them demonstrate the same thing. African peoples have always been innovators in communication technology. What strikes me most about these discoveries is how they force us to reconsider our assumptions about oral versus written cultures. The conventional wisdom suggests that societies were either oral or literate, but the African evidence shows something more complex. African communities often maintained both traditions simultaneously, using writing for some purposes while preserving oral traditions for others. This dual approach to knowledge preservation might actually be more sophisticated than purely written or purely oral systems. It allows for the precision and permanence of written records while maintaining the flexibility and performance power of oral tradition. It's a model of cultural preservation that other societies could learn from. But there's still so much we don't know about Africa's lost scripts. How many other writing systems have been lost to time? What knowledge was preserved in manuscripts that have since deteriorated? What innovations in communication technology did African communities develop that we haven't yet discovered? Every archaeological excavation, every linguistic study, every investigation into African oral traditions reveals new evidence of sophisticated communication systems that challenge our understanding of African intellectual history. The story of Africa's lost scripts isn't just about the past. It's about the present and future. Understanding these traditions helps us recognize that the intellectual achievements of modern African communities have deep historical roots. The innovations we see coming out of Africa today, in technology, in literature, and in scientific research, are part of a continuous tradition of African intellectual excellence that spans millennia. When we learn about Nsibidi, Meroitic, and Guizi, we're not just discovering historical curiosities. We're uncovering evidence of human potential and creativity that has always been part of the African story. We're seeing proof that the ancestors of African Americans came from societies with rich intellectual traditions, sophisticated communication systems, and advanced approaches to preserving and transmitting knowledge. These lost scripts remind us that Africa has always been home to thinkers, innovators, and scholars. The narrative of African intellectual inferiority isn't just historically inaccurate. It's a deliberately constructed myth designed to justify centuries of exploitation and cultural suppression. But the truth survives. In museums around the world, you can see examples of Nsibidi symbols, Meroitic inscriptions, and Guizi manuscripts. In Ethiopian Orthodox churches, you can still hear Guizi being chanted during religious services. In southeastern Nigeria, some communities still recognize Nsibidi symbols and their meanings. The legacy of Africa's lost scripts lives on in every African language that developed its own writing system, in every African scholar who preserves oral traditions, and in every effort to document and celebrate African intellectual achievements. As we conclude this journey through Africa's lost scripts, remember that these discoveries are just the beginning. Every year brings new evidence of African intellectual sophistication, new proof that the continent has always been home to advanced societies with rich literary traditions. The next time someone suggests that Africa lacked writing or intellectual traditions before outside contact, remember the scribes of ancient Kush recording royal decrees in Meroitic, the secret societies of Nigeria preserving sacred knowledge in Nsibidi, and the scholars of Ethiopia creating one of the world's great literary traditions in Guizi. These weren't isolated achievements. They were part of a continental tradition of African literacy that challenges every stereotype about the continent's intellectual history. The lost scripts of Africa aren't really lost. They're waiting for us to rediscover them, celebrate them, and reclaim them as part of our shared heritage. What part of this story intrigued you the most? Were you surprised to learn about the antiquity of Nsibidi, the sophistication of Meroitic, or the continuity of Guizi? Did any of these discoveries change how you think about African intellectual traditions? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and your insights help shape future videos. If this story touched your spirit like it did mine, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Our stories deserve to be remembered, and your support helps keep these important conversations alive.